the 1840s. Another cause of hardship was the process known as enclosure, by which, from the 1770s, hundreds of small farms had been merged into the larger ones of powerful landlords. Poor rural families affected by this had sought industrial work, but the introduction of machines in the cotton industry threw thousands of handloom weavers out of work and into poverty, since their labor was too slow to compete with machines. From the 1790s, these weavers began to demand a legal minimum wage, which was refused by Parliament. When they went on strike, they were dispersed by force. In desperation, in Lancashire, cotton weavers destroyed the power looms which they believed had destroyed their livelihood. There was also resistance to the introduction of machines in the wool and knitting industry in Nottingham. Protests also took place in Leicestershire and Derbyshire. In Yorkshire, shearing frames were destroyed by croppers, who had traditionally sheared sheep by hand. In the riots of 1830, farm laborers found their jobs threatened by the new threshing machines that separated the grain from the husk. The rioters smashed these machines. 9 of them were hanged and 450 were sent to Australia as convicts. The movement known as Luddism, 1811-17, led by the charismatic General Ned Ludd, exemplified another type of protest. Luddism was not merely a backward-looking assault on machines. Its participants demanded a minimum wage, control over the labor of women and children, work for those who had lost their jobs because of the coming of machinery, and the right to form trade unions so that they could legally present these demands. During the early years of industrialization, the working population possessed neither the vote nor legal methods to express their anger at the drastic manner in which their lives had been overturned. In August 1819, 80,000 people gathered peacefully at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester to claim democratic rights, of political organization, of public meetings, and of the freedom of the press. They were suppressed brutally in what became known as the Peterloo Massacre, and the rights they demanded were denied by the 6 Acts, passed by Parliament the same year. These extended the restrictions on political activity introduced in the 2 Combination Acts of 1795, but there were some gains. After Peterloo, the need to make the House of Commons more representative was recognized by liberal political groups, and the Combination Acts were repealed in 1824-25. Reforms through laws. How attentive was the government to the conditions of work of women and children? Laws were passed in 1819 prohibiting the employment of children under the age of 9 in factories and limiting the hours of work of those between the ages of 9 and 16 to 12 hours a day. But this law lacked the powers needed for its enforcement. It was not until 1833, after intense protest by workers throughout the north of England, that an act was passed that permitted children under 9 to be employed only in silk factories, limited the hours of work for older children, and provided a number of factory inspectors to ensure that the act was enforced. Finally, in 1847, after more than 30 years of agitation, the 10 Hours Bill was passed. This limited the hours of work for women and young people, and secured a 10-hour day for male workers. These acts applied to the textile industries but not to the mining industry. The Mines Commission of 1842, set up by the government, revealed that working conditions in mines had actually become worse since the Act of 1833, because more children had been put to work in coal mines. The Mines and Collieries Act of 1842 banned children under 10 and women from working underground. Fielder's Factory Act laid down in 1847 that children under 18 and women should not work more than 10 hours a day. These laws were to be enforced by factory inspectors, but this was difficult to do. The inspectors were poorly paid and easily bribed by factory managers, while parents lied about the real ages of their children, so that they could work and contribute to family incomes. The debate on the Industrial Revolution. Until the 1970s, historians used the term Industrial Revolution for the changes that occurred in Britain from the 1780s to the 1820s. From then, it was challenged, on various grounds. Industrialization had actually been too gradual to be considered a revolution. It carried processes that already existed towards new levels. Thus, there was a relatively greater concentration of workers in factories, and a wider use of money. Until well into the 19th century, large regions of England remained untouched by factories or mines, and therefore the term industrial revolution was regarded as inaccurate. England had changed in a regional manner, prominently around the cities of London, Manchester, Birmingham or Newcastle, rather than throughout the country. Could the growth in the cotton or iron industries or in foreign trade from the 1780s to the 1820s be called revolutionary? The impressive growth of cotton textiles, based on new machinery, was in an industry that relied on a non-British raw material, on sales abroad, especially India, on non-metallic machinery, and with few links to other branches of industry. Metallic machinery and steam power was rare until much later in the 19th century. The rapid growth in British imports and exports from the 1780s occurred because of the resumption of trade with North America that the War of American Independence had interrupted. This growth was recorded as being sharp only because it started from a low point. Indicators of economic change occurring before and after 1815 to 1820 suggest that sustained industrialization was to be seen after rather than before these dates. The decades after 1793 had experienced the disruptive effects of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Industrialization is associated with a growing investment of the country's wealth in capital formation, or building infrastructure and installing new machinery, and with raising the levels of efficient use of these facilities, and with raising productivity. Productive investment, in these senses, grew steadily only after 1820, as did levels of productivity. The cotton, iron and engineering industries had accounted for less than half of the industrial output until the 1840s. Technical progress was not limited to these branches, but was visible in other branches too, like agricultural processing and pottery. In searching for an answer as to why British growth may have been faster after 1815 than before, historians have pointed to the fact that from the 1760s to 1815, Britain tried to do two things simultaneously: to industrialize, and to fight wars in Europe, North America and India, and it may possibly have failed with one. Britain was at war for 36 out of 60 years from 1760. Capital that was borrowed was used to fight the wars rather than invested. As much as 35% of the cost of the war was met by taxing people's incomes. Workers were transferred out of factories and farms to the army. Food prices rose so sharply that the poor had little money left for buying consumer goods. Napoleon's policies of blockade, and British reactions to them, closed the European continent, the destination for more than half of British exports, to British traders. The word industrial, used with the word revolution, is too limited. The transformation extended beyond the economic or industrial sphere and into society and gave prominence to two classes, the bourgeoisie and the new class of proletarian laborers in towns and in the countryside. In 1851, visitors thronged the Great Exhibition at the specially constructed Crystal Palace in London to view the achievements of British industry. At that time, half the population was living in towns, but of the workers in towns as many were in handicraft units as in factories. From the 1850s, the proportion of people living in urban areas went up dramatically, and most of these were workers in industry, the working class. Only 20% of Britain's workforce now lived in rural areas. This was a far more rapid rate of industrialization than had been witnessed in other European countries. In his detailed study of British industry, the historian A.E. Musson has suggested that there are good grounds for regarding the period 1850 to 1914 as that in which the Industrial Revolution really occurred, on a massive scale, transforming the whole economy and society much more widely and deeply than the earlier changes had done, linking the world. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh, 25 years old, flew across the Atlantic Ocean, from EW York to Paris, in a single-engine aeroplane. 1. The Flying Shuttle Loom, designed by John Kay, 1704 to 1764, in 1733 made it possible to weave broader fabrics in less time and consequently called for more yarn than could be supplied at the prevailing pace of spinning. 2. The spinning jenny was a machine made by James Hargreaves, 1720 to 1778, in 1765 on which a single person could spin several threads of yarn simultaneously. This provided weavers with yarn at a faster rate than they could weave into fabric. 3. The water frame, which Richard Arkwright, 1732 to 1792, invented in 1769, produced a much stronger thread than before. This also made it possible to weave pure cotton fabrics rather than fabrics that combined linen and cotton yarn. 4. The mule was the nickname for a machine invented in 1779 by Samuel Crompton, 1753 to 1827, that allowed the spinning of strong and fine yarn. 5. The cycle of inventions in the cotton textile industry that sought to maintain a balance between the tasks of spinning and weaving concluded with the invention of the power loom by Edmund Cartwright, 1743 to 1823, in 1787. This was easy to work, stopped automatically every time a thread broke and could be used to weave any kind of material. From the 1830s, developments in this industry concentrated on increasing the productivity of workers rather than bringing new machines into use. Watt's inventions were not limited to the steam engine. He invented a chemical process for copying documents. He also created a unit of measurement based on comparing mechanical power with that of the previous universal power source, the horse. Watt's measurement unit, horsepower, equated the ability of a horse to lift 33,000 pounds, 14,969 kg, 1 foot, 0.3 meter, in 1 minute. Horsepower remains universally used as an index of mechanical energy. Who were the inventors? It is interesting to find out who the individuals were who brought about these changes. Few of them were trained scientists. Education in basic sciences like physics or chemistry was extremely limited until the late 19th century, well after the technological inventions described above. Since these breakthroughs did not require a full knowledge of the laws of physics or chemistry on which they were based, advances could be and were made by brilliant but intuitive thinkers and persistent experimenters. They were helped by the fact that England had certain features which European countries did not. Dozens of scientific journals and published papers of scientific societies appeared in England between 1760 and 1800. There was a widespread thirst for knowledge even in the smaller towns. This was met by the activities. Society of Arts, founded in 1754, by traveling lecturers, or in coffee houses that multiplied through the 18th century. Most inventions were more the product of determination, interest, curiosity, even luck, than the application of scientific knowledge. Some inventors in the cotton industry, like John Kay and James Hargreaves, were familiar with the skills of weaving and carpentry. Richard Arkwright, however, was a barber and wig maker. Samuel Crompton was not technically skilled, and Edmund Cartwright studied literature, medicine and agriculture, initially wished to become a clergyman, and knew little of mechanics. By contrast, in the area of steam engines, Thomas Savery, an army officer, Thomas Newcomen, a blacksmith and locksmith, and James Watt, with a strong mechanical bent, all had some knowledge relevant to their inventions. The road builder John Metcalfe, who personally surveyed surfaces for roads and planned them, was blind. The canal builder James Brindley was almost illiterate, with such poor spelling that he could never spell the word navigation, but he had tremendous powers of memory, imagination and concentration. Edward Carpenter eloquently described such cities in about 1881, in his poem, In a Manufacturing Town, as I walked restless and despondent through the gloomy city, and saw the eager unresting to and fro, as of ghosts in some sulphurous Hades, and saw the crowds of tall chimneys going up, and the pall of smoke covering the sun, covering the earth, lying heavy against the very ground, and saw the huge refuse heaps writhing with children picking them over, and the ghastly half-roofless smoke-blackened houses, and the black river flowing below. As I saw these, and as I saw again far away the capitalist quarter, with its villa residences and its high-walled gardens and its well-appointed carriages, and its face turned away from the wriggling poverty which made it rich, I shuddered. Hard Times. In his novel Hard Times, Charles Dickens, 1812-70, perhaps the most severe contemporary critic of the horrors of industrialization for the poor, wrote a fictional account of an industrial town he aptly called Coketown. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it, but as matters stood it was a town of unnatural red and black like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of building full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down, like the head of an elephant in a stare of melancholy madness. D. H. Lawrence, 1885–1930, British essayist and novelist, writing 70 years after Dickens, described the change in a village in the coal belt, change which he had not experienced, but about which he had heard from older people. Eastwood must have been a tiny village at the beginning of the 19th century, a small place of cottages and fragmentary rows of little four-roomed miners' dwellings, the homes of the old colliers. But somewhere about 1820 the company must have sunk the first big shaft, and installed the first machinery of the real industrial colliery. Most of the little rows of dwellings were pulled down, and dull little shops began to rise along the Nottingham Road, while on the downslope, the company erected what is still known as the new buildings, little four-room houses looking outward into the grim, blank street, and the back looking into the desert of the square, shut in like a barracks enclosure. Very strange. Theme 10. Displacing indigenous peoples. This chapter recounts some aspects of the histories of the native peoples of America and Australia. Theme 8 described the history of the Spanish and Portuguese colonization of South America. From the 18th century, more areas of South America, Central America, North America, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand came to be settled by immigrants from Europe. This led to many of the native peoples being pushed out into other areas. The European settlements were called colonies. When the European inhabitants of the colonies became independent of the European mother country, these colonies became states or countries. In the 19th and 20th centuries, people from Asian countries also migrated to some of these countries. Today, these Europeans and Asians form the majority in these countries, and the number of the native inhabitants are very small. They are hardly seen in the towns, and people have forgotten that they once occupied much of the country, and that the names of many rivers, towns, etc., are derived from native names, e.g., Ohio, Mississippi and Seattle in the USA, Saskatchewan in Canada, Wollongong and Parramatta in Australia. Till the middle of the 20th century, American and Australian history textbooks used to describe how Europeans discovered the Americas and Australia. They hardly mentioned the native peoples except to suggest that they were hostile to Europeans. These peoples were, however, studied by anthropologists in America from the 1840s. Much later, from the 1960s, the native peoples were encouraged to write their own histories or to dictate them. This is called oral history. Today, it is possible to read historical works and fiction written by the native peoples, and visitors to museums in these countries will see galleries of native art and special museums which show the Aboriginal way of life. The new National Museum of the American Indian in the USA has been curated by American Indians themselves. European imperialism. The American empires of Spain and Portugal did not expand after the 17th century. From that time other countries, France, Holland and England, began to extend their trading activities and to establish colonies in America, Africa and Asia. Ireland also was virtually a colony of England, as the landowners there were mostly English settlers. From the 18th century, it became obvious that while it was the prospect of profit which drove people to establish colonies, there were significant variations in the nature of the control established. In South Asia, trading companies like the East India Company made themselves into political powers, defeated local rulers and annexed their territories. They retained the older well-developed administrative system and collected taxes from landowners. Later they built railways to make trade easier, excavated mines and established big plantations. In Africa, Europeans traded on the coast, except in South Africa, and only in the late 19th century did they venture into the interior. After this, some of the European countries reached an agreement to divide up Africa as colonies for themselves. The word settler is used for the Dutch in South Africa, the British in Ireland, New Zealand and Australia, and the Europeans in America. The official language in these colonies was English, except in Canada, where French is also an official language. North America. The continent of North America extends from the Arctic Circle to the Tropic of Cancer, from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. West of the chain of the Rocky Mountains is the desert of Arizona and Nevada, still further west the Sierra Nevada Mountains. To the east, the Great Plains, the Great Lakes, the valleys of the Mississippi and the Ohio and the Appalachian Mountains. To the south is Mexico. 40% of Canada is covered with forests. Oil, gas and mineral resources are found in many areas, which explains the many big industries in the USA and Canada. Today, wheat, corn and fruit are grown extensively and fishing is a major industry in Canada. Mining, industry and extensive agriculture have been developed only in the last 200 years by immigrants from Europe, Africa and China, but there were people who had been living in North America for thousands of years before the Europeans learnt of its existence. The Ative peoples, the earliest inhabitants of North America, came from Asia over 30,000 years ago on a land bridge across the Bering Straits, and during the last Ice Age 10,000 years ago they moved further south. The oldest artifact found in America, an arrow point, is 11,000 years old. The population started to increase about 5,000 years ago when the climate became more stable. These peoples lived in bands, in villages along river valleys. They ate fish and meat, and cultivated vegetables and maize. They often went on long journeys in search of meat, chiefly that of bison, the wild buffalo that roamed the grasslands. This became easier from the 17th century, when the natives started to ride horses, which they bought from Spanish settlers. But they only killed as many animals as they needed for food. They did not attempt extensive agriculture, and since they did not produce a surplus, they did not develop kingdoms and empires as in Central and South America. There were some instances of quarrels between tribes over territory, but by and large control of land was not an issue. They were content with the food and shelter they got from the land without feeling any need to own it. An important feature of their tradition was that of making formal alliances and friendships, and exchanging gifts. Goods were obtained not by buying them, but as gifts. Numerous languages were spoken in North America, though these were not written down. They believed that time moved in cycles, and each tribe had accounts about their origins and their earlier history which were passed on from one generation to the next. They were skilled craftspeople and wove beautiful textiles. They could read the land, they could understand the climates and different landscapes in the way literate people read written texts. In the 17th century, the European traders who reached the north coast of North America after a difficult 2-month voyage were relieved to find the native peoples friendly and welcoming. Unlike the Spanish in South America, who were overcome by the abundance of gold in the country, these adventurers came to trade in fish and furs, in which they got the willing help of the natives who were expert at hunting. Further south, along the Mississippi River, the French found that the natives held regular gatherings to exchange handicrafts unique to a tribe or food items not available in other regions. In exchange for local products, the Europeans gave the natives blankets, iron vessels, which they used sometimes in place of their clay pots, guns, which was a useful supplement for bows and arrows to kill animals, and alcohol. This last item was something the natives had not known earlier, and they became addicted to it, which suited the Europeans, because it enabled them to dictate terms of trade. The Europeans acquired from the natives an addiction to tobacco. Mutual perceptions in the 18th century, Western Europeans defined civilized people in terms of literacy, and organized religion and urbanism. To them, the natives of America appeared uncivilized. To some, like the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, such people were to be admired, as they were untouched by the corruptions of civilization. A popular term was the noble savage. Some lines in a poem by the English poet William Wordsworth indicate another perspective. Neither he nor Rousseau had met a Native American, but Wordsworth described them as living amid wilds, where fancy hath small liberty to grace the affections, to exalt them or refine, meaning that people living close to nature had only limited powers of imagination and emotion. To the natives, the goods they exchanged with the Europeans were gifts, given in friendship. For the Europeans, dreaming of becoming rich, the fish and furs were commodities, which they would sell for a profit in Europe. The prices of the goods they sold varied from year to year, depending on the supply. The natives could not understand this. They had no sense of the market in faraway Europe. They were puzzled by the fact that the European traders sometimes gave them a lot of things in exchange for their goods, sometimes very little. They were also saddened by the greed of the Europeans. In their impatience to get furs, they had slaughtered hundreds of beavers, and the natives were very uneasy, fearing that the animals would take revenge on them for this destruction. Following the first Europeans, who were traders, were those who came to settle in America. From the 17th century, there were groups of Europeans who were being persecuted because they were of a different sect of Christianity. Protestants living in predominantly Catholic countries, or Catholics in countries where Protestantism was the official religion. Many of them left Europe and went to America to begin a new life. As long as there was vacant land, this was not a problem, but gradually the Europeans moved further inland, near native villages. They used their iron tools to cut down forests to lay out farms. Natives and Europeans saw different things when they looked at forests. Natives identified tracks invisible to the Europeans. Europeans imagined the forests cut down and replaced by cornfields. Jefferson's dream was a country populated by Europeans with small farms. The natives, who grew crops for their own needs, not for sale and profit, and thought it wrong to own the land, could not understand this. In Jefferson's view, this made them uncivilized. The countries that are known as Canada and the United States of America came into existence at the end of the 18th century. At that time they occupied only a fraction of the land they now cover. Over the next 100 years they extended their control over more territory, to reach their present size. Large areas were acquired by the USA by purchase. They bought land in the south from France, the Louisiana Purchase, and from Russia, Alaska, and by war, much of southern USA was won from Mexico. It did not occur to anyone that the consent of natives living in these areas should have been asked. The western frontier of the USA was a shifting one, and as it moved, the natives also were forced to move back. The landscapes of America changed drastically in the 19th century. The Europeans treated the land differently from the natives. Some of the migrants from Britain and France were younger sons who would not inherit their father's property and therefore were eager to own land in America. Later, there were waves of immigrants from countries like Germany, Sweden and Italy who had lost their lands to big farmers, and wanted farms they could own. People from Poland were happy to work in the prairie grasslands, which reminded them of the steppes of their homes, and were excited at being able to buy huge properties at very low prices. They cleared land and developed agriculture, producing crops, rice and cotton, which could not grow Europe and therefore could be sold there for profit. To protect their huge farms from wild animals, wolves and mountain lions, these were hunted to extinction. They felt totally secure only with the invention of barbed wire in 1873. The climate of the southern region was too hot for Europeans to work outdoors, and the experience of South American colonies had shown that the natives who had been enslaved had died in large ranch in Colorado. Numbers. Plantation owners therefore bought slaves in Africa. Protests by anti-slavery groups led to a ban on slave trade, but the Africans who were in the USA remained slaves, as did their children. The northern states of the USA, where the economy did not depend on plantations, and therefore on slavery, argued for ending slavery, which they condemned as an inhuman practice. In 1861–65, there was a war between the states that wanted to retain slavery and those supporting abolition. The latter won. Slavery was abolished, though it was only in the 20th century that the African Americans were able to win the battle for civil liberties, and segregation between whites and non-whites in schools and public transport was ended. The Canadian government had a problem which was not to be solved for a long time, and which seemed more urgent than the question of the natives. In 1763 Canada had been won by the British after a war with France. The French settlers repeatedly demanded autonomous political status. It was only in 1867 that this problem was solved by organizing Canada as a confederation of autonomous states. Canada 1701. French treaty with natives of Quebec. 1763. Quebec conquered by the British. 1774. Quebec Act. 1791. Canada Constitutional Act, USA 1781. Britain recognizes USA as an independent country. 1783. British give Midwest to the USA. Canada, 1837. French-Canadian Rebellion, 1840. Canadian Union of Upper and Lower Canada, 1859. Canada Gold Rush, 1867. Confederation of Canada, 1869–85. Red River Rebellion by the Metis in Canada, 1876. Canada Indians Act, 1885. Transcontinental Railway links East and West Coasts. USA 1803. Louisiana purchased from France. 1825 to 58 natives in USA moved to reserves. 1832. Justice Marshall's judgment. 1849. American Gold Rush. 1861 to 65. American Civil War. 1865 to 90. American Indian Wars. 1870. Transcontinental Railway, 1890, bison almost exterminated in America, 1892, end of American frontier, the Native peoples lose their land in the USA, as settlement expanded, the natives were induced or forced to move, after signing treaties selling their land, the prices paid were very low, and there were instances when the Americans, a term used to mean the European people of the USA, cheated them by taking more land or paying less than promised. Even high officials saw nothing wrong in depriving the native peoples of their land. This is seen by an episode in Georgia, a state in the USA. This is seen by an episode in Georgia, a state in the USA. Officials had argued that the Cherokee tribe was governed by state laws, but could not enjoy the rights of citizens. This was despite the fact that, of all the native peoples, the Cherokees were the ones who had made the most effort to learn English and to understand the American way of life. Even so, they were not allowed the rights of citizens. In 1832, an important judgment was announced by the as Chief Justice, John Marshall. He said that the Cherokees were a distinct community, occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia had no force, and that they had sovereignty in certain matters. As President Andrew Jackson had a reputation for fighting against economic and political privilege, but when it came to the Indians, he was a different person. He refused to honor the Chief Justice's judgment, and ordered the U.S. Army to evict the Cherokees from their land and drive them to the Great American Desert. Of the 15,000 people thus forced to go, over a quarter died along the Trail of Tears. Those who took the land occupied by the tribes justified it by saying the natives did not deserve to occupy land which they did not use to the maximum. They went on to criticize them for being lazy, since they did not use their craft skills to produce goods for the market, for not being interested in learning English or dressing correctly, which meant like the Europeans, they deserved to die out, they argued. The prairies were cleared for farmland, and wild bison killed off. Primitive man will disappear with the primitive animal, wrote a visiting Frenchman. Meanwhile, the natives were pushed westward, given land elsewhere, theirs in perpetuity, but often moved again if any mineral, lead or gold, or oil was found on their lands. Many tribes were forced to share the land originally occupied by one tribe, thus leading to quarrels between them. They were locked off in small areas called reservations, which often was land with which they had no earlier connection. They did not give in without a fight. The U.S. Army crushed a series of rebellions from 1865 to 1890, and in Canada there were armed revolts by the Métis, people of native European descent, between 1869 and 1885, but after that they gave up. The gold rush, and the growth of industries. There was always the hope that there was gold in North America. In the 1840s, traces of gold were found in the USA, in California. This led to the gold rush, when thousands of eager Europeans hurried to America in the hope of making a quick fortune. This led to the building of railway lines across the continent, for which thousands of Chinese workers were recruited. The USA's railway was completed by 1870, that of Canada by 1885. The old nations creep on at a snail's pace, said Andrew Carnegie, a poor immigrant from Scotland who became one of the first millionaire industrialists in the USA. The Republic thunders on at the speed of an express. One reason why the Industrial Revolution happened in England when it did was because small peasants were losing their land to big farmers, and moving to jobs in factories. In North America, industries developed for very different reasons: to manufacture railway equipment so that rapid transport could link distant places, and to produce machinery which would make large-scale farming easier. Industrial towns grew and factories multiplied, both in the USA and Canada. In 1860, the USA had been an undeveloped economy. In 1890, it was the leading industrial power in the world. Large-scale agriculture also expanded. Vast areas were cleared and divided up into farms. By 1890, the bison had almost been exterminated, thus ending the life of hunting the natives had followed for centuries. In 1892, the USA's continental expansion was complete. The area between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans was divided up into states. There no longer remained the frontier that had pulled European settlers west for many decades. Within a few years the USA was setting up its own colonies, in Hawaii and the Philippines. It had become an imperial power. Constitutional rights, the democratic spirit, which had been the rallying cry of the settlers in their fight for independence in the 1770s, came to define the identity of the USA against the monarchies and aristocracies of the Old World. Also important to them was that their constitution included the individual's right to property, which the state could not override, but both democratic rights, the right to vote for representatives to Congress and for the president, and the right to property were only for white men. Daniel Paul, a Canadian native, pointed out in 2000 that Thomas Paine, the champion of democracy at the time of the War for American Independence and the French Revolution, used the Indians as models of how society might be organized. He used this to argue that the Native Americans by their example sowed the seeds for the long drawn-out movement towards democracy by the people of Europe. We were out the savages. p. 333, The Winds of Change. Not till the 1920s did things begin to improve for the native peoples of the USA and Canada. The Problem of Indian Administration, a survey directed by social scientist Louis Merriam and published in 1928, only a few years before the USA was swept by a major economic depression that affected all its people, painted a grim picture of the terribly poor health and education facilities for natives in reservations. White Americans felt sympathy for the natives who were being discouraged from the full exercise of their cultures and simultaneously denied the benefits of citizenship. This led to a landmark law in the USA, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which gave natives in reservations the right to buy land and take loans. In the 1950s and 1960s, the US and Canadian governments thought of ending all special provisions for the natives in the hope that they would join the mainstream, that is, adopt European culture, but the natives did not want this. In 1954, in the Declaration of Indian Rights prepared by them, a number of native peoples accepted citizenship of the USA but on condition that their reservations would not be taken away and their traditions would not be interfered with. A similar development occurred in Canada. In 1969 the government announced that they would not recognize Aboriginal rights. The natives, in a well-organized opposition move, held a series of demonstrations and debates. The question could not be resolved till 1982, when the Constitution Act accepted the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the natives. Many details remain to be worked out. Today, it is clear that the native peoples of both countries, though reduced so much in numbers from what they had been in the 18th century, have been able to assert their right to their own cultures and, particularly in Canada, to their sacred lands, in a way their ancestors could not have done in the 1880s. Indians under British rule. Taxed arbitrarily, seen as not equal, rationalization, not ready for responsibility of representative government. Natives in America and Australia, not seen as citizens, not equal, rationalization, primitive, as in no settled agriculture, provision for the future, towns. African slaves in America, denied personal liberty, not equal, rationalization, slavery is part of their own social system, black people are inferior, Australia is in the Americas, human habitation in Australia has a long history, the Aborigines, a general name given to a number of different societies, began to arrive on the continent over 40,000 years ago, it is possible it was even earlier. They came from New Guinea, which was connected to Australia by a land bridge. In the natives' traditions, they did not come to Australia, but had always been there. The past centuries were called the dream time, something difficult for Europeans to understand, since the distinction between past and present is blurred. In the late 18th century, there were between 350 and 750 native communities in Australia, each with its own language. Even today 200 of these languages are spoken. There is another large group of indigenous people living in the north, called the Torres Strait Islanders. The term Aborigine is not used for these as they are believed to have migrated from elsewhere and belong to a different race. Together, they make up 2.4% of Australia's population in 2005. Australia is sparsely populated, and even now most of the towns are along the coast, where the British first arrived in 1770, because the central region is arid desert. The story of the interaction between the European settlers, the native peoples and the land in Australia has many points of similarity to the story of the Americas, though it began nearly 300 years later. Initial reports from Captain Cook and his crew about encounters with natives are enthusiastic about their friendliness. There was a sharp reversal of feeling on the part of the British when Cook was killed by a native, not in Australia, but in Hawaii. As often happened, a single incident of this nature was used by colonizers to justify subsequent acts of violence towards other people. They did not foresee that in the 19th and 20th centuries nearly 90% of them would die by exposure to germs, by the loss of their lands and resources, and in battles against the settlers. The experiment of settling Brazil with Portuguese convicts had been abandoned when their violent behavior provoked angry reprisals from the natives. The British had adopted the same practice in the American colonies until they became independent. Then they continued it in Australia. Most of the early settlers were convicts who had been deported from England and, when their jail term ended, were allowed to live as free people in Australia on condition that they did not return to Britain, with no recourse but to make a life for themselves in this land so different from their own. They felt no hesitation about ejecting natives from land they took over for cultivation. The economic development of Australia under European settlement was not as varied as in America. Vast sheep farms and mining stations were established over a long period and with much labor, followed by vineyards and wheat farming. These came to form the basis of the country's prosperity. When the states were united, and it was decided that a new capital would be built for Australia in 1911, one name suggested for it was Woolwheat Gold. Ultimately, it was called Canberra, Canberra, a native word meaning meeting place. Some natives were employed in farms, under conditions of work so harsh that it was little different from slavery. Later, Chinese immigrants provided cheap labor, as in California, but unease about being dependent on non-whites led to the governments in both countries to ban Chinese immigrants. Till 1974, such was the popular fear that dark people from South Asia or Southeast Asia might migrate to Australia in large numbers that there was a government policy to keep non-white people out. The winds of change. In 1968, people were electrified by a lecture by the anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner, entitled The Great Australian Silence, The Silence of Historians About the Aborigines. From the 1970s, as was happening in North America, there was an eagerness to understand natives not as anthropological curiosities but as communities with distinct cultures, unique ways of understanding nature and climate, with a sense of community which had vast bodies of stories, textile and painting and carving skills, which should be understood and recorded and respected. Underlying it all was the urgent question which Henry Reynolds later articulated in a powerful book, Why Were Not We Told? This condemned the practice of writing Australian history as though it had begun with Captain Cook's discovery. Since then, university departments have been instituted to study native cultures, galleries of native art have been added to art galleries, museums have been enlarged to incorporate dioramas and imaginatively designed rooms explaining native culture, and natives have begun writing their own life histories. This has been a wonderful effort. It has also occurred at a critical time, because if native cultures had remained ignored, by this time much of such cultures would have been forgotten. From 1974, multiculturalism has been official policy in Australia, which gave equal respect to native cultures and to the different cultures of the immigrants from Europe and Asia. From the 1970s, as the term human rights began to be heard at meetings of the UNO and other international agencies, the Australian public realized with dismay that, in contrast to the USA, Canada and New Zealand, Australia had no treaties with the natives formalizing the takeover of land by Europeans. The government had always termed the land of Australia terra nullius, that is belonging to nobody. There was also a long and agonizing history of children of mixed blood, native European, being forcibly captured and separated from their native relatives. Agitation around these questions led to enquiries and to two important decisions. 1. To recognize that the natives had strong historic bonds with the land which was sacred to them, and which should be respected. 2. That while past acts could not be undone, there should be a public apology for the injustice done to children in an attempt to keep white and colored people apart. 1974, White Australia, Policy ends, Asian immigrants allowed entry. 1992, the Australian High Court, in the Mabo case, declares that terra nullius was legally invalid, and recognized native claims to land from before 1770. 1995, the National Enquiry into the Separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children from Their Families. 1999, the 26th of May, a National Sorry Day, as apology for the children, lost, from the 1820s to the 1970s. Names given by Europeans to countries of the New World, America, first used after the publication of the Travels of Amerigo Vespucci, 1451-1512, Canada, from Kannada, equals, village, in the language of the Huron Iroquois, as heard by the explorer Jacques Cartier in 1535, Australia, 16th century name for land in the Great Southern Ocean, Austral is Latin for south, New Zealand, name given by Tasman of Holland, who was the first to cite these islands in 1642, Z is Dutch for sea. The Geographical Dictionary lists over 100 place names in the Americas and Australia which begin with new. Native means a person born in the place she lives in. Till the early 20th century, the term was used by Europeans to describe the inhabitants of countries they had colonized, at sunset on the day before America, that is, before the Europeans reached there and gave the continent this name. Diversity lay at every hand. People spoke in more than 100 tongues. They lived by every possible combination of hunting, fishing, gathering, gardening, and farming open to them. The quality of soils and the effort required to open and tend them determined some of their choices of how to live. Cultural and social biases determined others. Surpluses of fish or grain or garden plants or meats helped create powerful, tiered societies here but not there. Some cultures had endured for millennia. William McLeish, The Day Before America, Encounters with Europeans. Different terms are used in English for the native peoples of the New World. Aborigine, native people of Australia. In Latin, ab equals from, origine equals the beginning. Aboriginal, adjective, often misused as a noun. American Indian, Amerindian, Amerindian, native peoples of North and South America and the Caribbean. First Nations peoples, the organized native groups recognized by the Canadian government. The Indians Act of 1876 used the term bands, but from the 1980s the word nation is used. Indigenous people, people belonging naturally to a place. Native American, the indigenous people of the Americas, this is the term now commonly used. Red Indian, the brown-complexioned people whose land Columbus mistook for India. A woman of the Winnebago tribe of Wisconsin. In the 1860s, people of this tribe were moved to Nebraska. It was indicated on the stone tablets that the Hopi had that the first brothers and sisters that would come back to them would come as turtles across the land. They would be human beings, but they would come as turtles. So when the time came closed, the Hopi were at a special village to welcome the turtles that would come across the land, and they got up in the morning and looked out at the sunrise. They looked out across the desert and they saw the Spanish conquistadores coming, covered in armor, like turtles across the land. So this was them. So they went out to the Spanish man and they extended their hand hoping for the handshake, but into the hand the Spanish man dropped a trinket. And so word spread throughout North America that there was going to be a hard time, that maybe some of the brothers and sisters had forgotten the sacredness of all things and all the human beings were going to suffer for this on the earth. From a talk by Lee Brown, 1986. The Hopi are a native tribe who now live near California. It is interesting to note that another writer, Washington Irving, much younger than Wordsworth and who had actually met native people, described them quite differently. The Indians I have had an opportunity of seeing in real life are quite different from those described in poetry. Taciturn they are, it is true, when in company with white men, whose goodwill they distrust and whose language they do not understand, but the white man is equally taciturn under like circumstances. When the Indians are among themselves, they are great mimics, and entertain themselves excessively at the expense of the whites, who have supposed them impressed with profound respect for their grandeur and dignity. The white men, as I have witnessed, are prone to treat the poor Indians as little better than animals. Thomas Jefferson, third President of the USA, and a contemporary of Wordsworth, spoke of the natives in words that would lead to a public outcry today. This unfortunate race which we have been taking so much pains to civilize, have justified extermination. Anthropology. It is significant that it was at this time, from the 1840s, that the subject of anthropology, which had been developed in France, was introduced in North America, out of a curiosity to study the differences between native, primitive, communities and the civilized communities of Europe. Some anthropologists argued that just as there were no primitive people to be found in Europe, the American natives too would die out. In 1854, the President of the USA received a letter from a native leader, Chief Seattle. The President had asked the chief to sign a treaty giving a large part of the land they lived on to the American government. The chief replied, "How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us. If you do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can one buy them? Every part of the earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every clearing and every humming insect is holy in the memory and experience of my people. The sap which courses through the trees carries the memories of the red man. So, when the great chief in Washington sends word that he wishes to buy our land, he asks much of us. The great chief sends word that he will reserve us a place so that we can live comfortably. He will be our father and we will be his children. So we will consider your offer to buy our land. But it will not be easy, for this land is sacred to us. The shining water that moves the streams and rivers is not just water but the blood of our ancestors. If we sell you land, you must remember that it is sacred and you must teach your children that it is sacred and that each ghostly reflection in the clear water of the lakes tells of events and memories in the life of my people. The water's murmur is the voice of my father's father." Karl Marx, 1818–1883, the great German philosopher, described the American frontier as the last positive capitalist utopia, the limitless nature and space to which the limitless thirst for profit adapts itself. Bastiat and Carey, Grundrisse. The Europeans reach Australia 1606. Dutch travelers sight Australia, 1642. Tasman lands on the island later named Tasmania, 1770. James Cook reaches Botany Bay, named New South Wales, 1788. British penal colony formed. Sydney founded. A description of the Sydney area in 1790. Aboriginal production had been dramatically disturbed by the British presence. The arrival of 1,000 hungry mouths, followed by hundreds more, put unprecedented pressure on local food resources. So what would the Darug people have thought of all this? To them such large-scale destruction of sacred places and strange, violent behavior towards their land was inexplicable. The newcomers seemed to knock down trees without any reason, for they were not making canoes, gathering bush honey or catching animals. Stones were moved and stacked together, clay dug up, shaped and cooked, holes were made in the ground, large unwieldy structures built. At first they may have equated the clearing with the creation of a sacred ceremonial ground. Perhaps they thought a huge ritual gathering was to be held, dangerous business from which they should steer well clear. There is no doubt the Darug subsequently avoided the settlement, for the only way to bring them back. McGrath, M. Courtley, Creating Asian, The Development of Australia. 1850, self-government granted to Australian colonies. 1851. Chinese coolie immigration. Stopped by law in 1855. 1851 to 1961. Gold rushes. 1901. Formation of Federation of Australia, with 6 states. 1911. Canberra established as capital. 1948 to 75. 2 million Europeans migrate to Australia. Kathy, my sister with the torn heart, I do not know how to thank you for your Dreamtime stories of joy and grief written on paperbark. You were one of the dark children I was not allowed to play with. Riverbank campers, the wrong color, I could not turn you white, so it was late I met you, late I began to know they hadn't told me the land I loved was taken out of your hands. 2 Dreamtimes, written for Ajaru Nunukal. Judith Wright, 1915 to 2000, an Australian writer, was a champion of the rights of the Australian Aborigines. She wrote many moving poems about the loss created by keeping the white people and the natives apart. Theme 11. Paths to Modernization. East Asia at the beginning of the 19th century was dominated by China. The Qing dynasty, heir to a long tradition, seemed secure in its power, while Japan, a small island country, seemed to be locked in isolation. Yet, within a few decades China was thrown into turmoil, unable to face the colonial challenge. The imperial government lost political control, was unable to reform effectively, and the country was convulsed by civil war. Japan, on the other hand, was successful in building a modern nation-state, creating an industrial economy and even establishing a colonial empire by incorporating Taiwan, 1895, and Korea, 1910. It defeated China, the land that had been the source of its culture and ideals, in 1894, and Russia, a European power, in 1905. The Chinese reacted slowly and faced immense difficulties as they sought to redefine their traditions to cope with the modern world, and to rebuild their national strength and become free from Western and Japanese control. They found that they could achieve both objectives, of removing inequalities and of rebuilding their country, through revolution. The Chinese Communist Party emerged victorious from the Civil War in 1949. However, by the end of the 1970s, Chinese leaders felt that the ideological system was retarding economic growth and development. This led to wide-ranging reforms of the economy that brought back capitalism and the free market, even as the Communist Party retained political control. Japan became an advanced industrial nation, but its drive for empire led to war and defeat at the hands of the Anglo-American forces. This occupation marked the beginning of a more democratic political system, and Japan rebuilt its economy to emerge by the 1970s as a major economic power. The Japanese path to modernization was built on capitalist principles and took place within a world dominated by Western colonialism. Japanese expansion was justified by the call to resist Western domination and liberate Asia. The rapid development underlined the strength of tradition in Japanese institutions and society, their ability to learn, and the strength of nationalism. China and Japan have had a long tradition of historical writings, as history was an important guide for the rulers. The past provided the standards by which they would be judged, and the rulers established official departments to maintain records and write dynastic histories. Sima Qian, 145–90 BCE, is considered the greatest historian of early China. In Japan, Chinese cultural influence led to history being given a similar importance. One of the earliest acts of the Meiji government was to establish, in 1869, a bureau to collect records and write, as it were, a victor's version of the Meiji Restoration. There was great respect for the written word, and literary ability was highly valued. This has meant that a wide range of written materials, official histories, scholarly writings, popular literature, religious tracts, are available. Printing and publishing were important industries in the pre-modern period, and it is possible, for instance, to trace the distribution of a book in 18th century China or Japan. Modern scholars have used these materials in new and different ways. Modern scholarship has built on the work of Chinese intellectuals such as Leng Qichao or Kumku Natake (1839–1931), one of the pioneers of modern history in Japan, as well as earlier writings by European travelers, such as the Italian Marco Polo (1254–1324) in China from 1274 to 1290, the Jesuit priests Matteo Ricci (1552–1610) in China, and Louis Froys (1532–1597) in Japan, all of whom left rich accounts of these countries. It has also benefited from the writings of Christian missionaries in the 19th century, whose work provides valuable material for our understanding of these countries. Scholarship in English from Joseph Needham's monumental work on the history of science in Chinese civilization or George Sansom's on Japanese history and culture has grown, and there is an immense body of sophisticated scholarship available to us today. In recent years, writings by Chinese and Japanese scholars have been translated into English, some of whom teach abroad and write in English, and in the case of Chinese scholars, since the 1980s, many have been working in Japan as well and write in Japanese. This has meant that we have scholarly writings from many parts of the globe that give us a richer and deeper picture of these countries. Nato Konan, 1866–1934, a leading Japanese scholar of China, Nato Konan's writings influenced scholars worldwide. Using the new tools of Western historiography, Nato built on a long tradition of studying China as well as bringing his experience as a journalist there. He helped establish the Department of Oriental Studies in Kyoto University in 1907. In Chinaran, on China, 1914, he argued that Republican government offered the Chinese a way to end aristocratic control and centralized power that had existed since the Sung dynasty, 960–1279, a way to revitalize local society where reform must begin. He saw in Chinese history strengths that would make it modern and democratic. Japan, he thought, had an important role to play in China, but he underestimated the power of Chinese nationalism. Introduction. China and Japan present a marked physical contrast. China is a vast continental country that spans many climatic zones. The core is dominated by three major river systems: the Yellow River, Huanghe, the Yangtze River, Changjiang, the third longest river in the world, and the Pearl River. A large part of the country is mountainous. The dominant ethnic group are the Han and the major language is Chinese, Putonghua, but there are many other nationalities such as the Uyghur, Hui, Manchu and Tibetan, and aside from dialects such as Cantonese, Yu, and Shanghainese, Wu, there are other minority languages spoken as well. Chinese food reflects this regional diversity with at least 4 distinct types. The best known is Southern or Cantonese cuisine, as most overseas Chinese come from the Canton area, which includes dim sum, literally touch your heart, an assortment of pastries and dumplings. In the north, wheat is the staple food, while in Szechuan spices brought by Buddhist monks in the ancient period, along the Silk Route, and chilies by Portuguese traders in the 15th century, have created a fiery cuisine. In eastern China, both rice and wheat are eaten. Japan, by contrast, is a string of islands, the 4 largest being Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku and Hokkaido. The Okinawan chain is the southernmost, about the same latitude as the Bahamas. More than 50% of the land area of the main islands is mountainous, and Japan is situated in a very active earthquake zone. These geographical conditions have influenced architecture. The population is largely Japanese, but there are a small Ainu minority and Koreans who were forcibly brought as labor when Korea was a Japanese colony. Japan lacks a tradition of animal rearing. Rice is the staple crop and fish the major source of protein. Raw fish, sashimi or sushi, has now become a widely popular dish around the world as it is considered very healthy. Japa. The political system. An emperor had ruled Japan from Kyoto, but by the 12th century the imperial court lost power to shoguns, who in theory ruled in the name of the emperor. From 1603 to 1867, members of the Tokugawa family held the position of shogun. The country was divided into over 250 domains under the rule of lords called daimyo. The shogun exercised power over the domainal lords, ordering them to stay at the capital Edo, modern Tokyo, for long periods so that they would not pose a threat. He also controlled the major cities and mines. The samurai, the warrior class, were the ruling elite and served the shoguns and daimyo. In the late 16th century, 3 changes laid the pattern for future development. 1. The peasantry was disarmed and only the samurai could carry swords. This ensured peace and order, ending the frequent wars of the previous century. 2. The daimyo were ordered to live in the capitals of their domains, each with a large degree of autonomy. 3rd, land surveys identified owners and taxpayers and graded land productivity to ensure a stable revenue base. the daimyos capitals became bigger, so that by the mid-17th century, Japan not only had the most populated city in the world, Edo, but also two other large cities, Osaka and Kyoto, and at least half a dozen castle towns with populations of over 50,000. By contrast, most European countries of the time had only one large city. This led to the growth of a commercial economy, and created financial and credit systems. A person's merit began to be more valued than his status. A vibrant culture blossomed in the towns, where the fast-growing class of merchants patronized theater and the arts. As people enjoyed reading, it became possible for gifted writers to earn a living solely by writing. In Edo, people could rent a book for the price of a bowl of noodles. This shows how popular reading had become and gives a glimpse into the scale of printing. Japan was considered rich because it imported luxury goods like silk from China and textiles from India. Paying for these imports with gold and silver strained the economy and led the Tokugawa to put restrictions on the export of precious metals. They also took steps to develop the silk industry in Nishigen and Kyoto so as to reduce imports. The silk from Nishigen came to be known as the best in the world. Other developments such as the increased use of money and the creation of a stock market in rice show that the economy was developing in new ways. Social and intellectual changes, such as the study of ancient Japanese literature, led people to question the degree of Chinese influence and to argue that the essence of being Japanese could be found long before the contact with China, in such early classics as the Tale of the Genji and in the myths of origin that said that the islands were created by the gods and that the emperor was a descendant of the sun goddess. The Meiji Restoration internal discontent coincided with demands for trade and diplomatic relations. In 1853, the USA sent Commodore Matthew Perry (1794–1858) to Japan to demand that the government sign a treaty that would permit trade and open diplomatic relations, which it did the following year. Japan lay on the route to China, which the USA saw as a major market. Also, their whaling ships in the Pacific needed a place to refuel. At that time, there was only one Western country that traded with Japan, Holland. Perry's arrival had an important effect on Japanese politics. The emperor, who till then had had little political power, now re-emerged as an important figure. In 1868, a movement forcibly removed the shogun from power, and brought the emperor to Edo. This was made the capital and renamed Tokyo, which means Eastern Capital. Officials and the people were aware that some European countries were building colonial empires in India and elsewhere. News of China being defeated by the British was flowing in, and this was even depicted in popular plays, so that there was a real fear that Japan might be made a colony. Many scholars and leaders wanted to learn from the new ideas in Europe rather than ignore them as the Chinese were doing. Others sought to exclude the Europeans even while being ready to adopt the new technologies they offered. Some argued for a gradual and limited opening to the outer world. The government launched a policy with the slogan, Fukoku Kiyohei, rich country, strong army. They realized that they needed to develop their economy and build a strong army, otherwise they would face the prospect of being subjugated like India. To do this they needed to create a sense of nationhood among the people, and to transform subjects into citizens. At the same time, the new government also worked to build what they called the emperor system. Japanese scholars use this term as the emperor was part of a system, along with the bureaucracy and the military, that exercised power. Officials were sent to study the European monarchies on which they planned to model their own. The emperor would be treated with reverence as he was considered a direct descendant of the sun goddess, but he was also shown as the leader of westernization. His birthday became a national holiday, he wore Western-style military uniforms, and edicts were issued in his name to set up modern institutions. The Imperial Rescript on Education of 1890 urged people to pursue learning, advance public good and promote common interests. A new school system began to be built from the 1870s. Schooling was compulsory for boys and girls and by 1910 almost universal. Tuition fees were minimal. The curriculum had been based on Western models, but by the 1870s, while emphasizing modern ideas, stress was placed on loyalty and the study of Japanese history. The Ministry of Education exercised control over the curriculum and in the selection of textbooks, as well as in teachers' training. What was called moral culture had to be taught, and texts urged children to revere their parents, be loyal to the nation, and become good citizens. To integrate the nation, the Meiji government imposed a new administrative structure by altering old village and domain boundaries. The administrative unit had to have revenue adequate to maintain the local schools and health facilities, as well as serve as a recruitment center for the military. All young men over 20 had to do a period of military service. A modern military force was developed. A legal system was set up to regulate the formation of political groups, control the holding of meetings, and impose strict censorship. In all these measures, the government had to face opposition. The military and the bureaucracy were put under the direct command of the emperor. This meant that even after a constitution was enacted, these two groups remained outside the control of the government. In all these measures, the government faced opposition. The tension between these different ideals represented by a democratic constitution and a modern army was to have far-reaching consequences. The army pressed for a vigorous foreign policy to acquire more territory. This led to wars with China and Russia, in both of which Japan was the victor. Popular demand for greater democracy was often in opposition to the government's aggressive policies. Japan developed economically and acquired a colonial empire that suppressed the spread of democracy at home and put it in collision with the people it colonized. Modernizing the economy. Another important part of the Meiji reforms was the modernizing of the economy. Funds were raised by levying an agricultural tax. Japan's first railway line, between Tokyo and the port of Yokohama, was built in 1870–72. Textile machinery was imported from Europe, and foreign technicians were employed to train workers, as well as to teach in universities and schools, and Japanese students were sent abroad. In 1872, modern banking institutions were launched. Companies like Mitsubishi and Sumitomo were helped through subsidies and tax benefits to become major shipbuilders, so that Japanese trade was from now carried in Japanese ships. Zaibatsu, large business organizations controlled by individual families, dominated the economy till after the Second World War. The population, 35 million in 1872, increased to 55 million in 1920. To reduce population pressure, the government actively encouraged migration, first to the northern island of Hokkaido, which had been a largely autonomous area where the indigenous people called the Ainu lived, and then to Hawaii and Brazil, as well as to the growing colonial empire of Japan. Within Japan there was a shift to towns as industry developed. By 1925, 21% of the population lived in cities. By 1935, this figure had gone up to 32%, 22.5 million. Industrial workers. The number of people in manufacturing increased from 700,000 in 1870 to 4 million in 1913. Most of them worked in units employing less than 5 people and using neither machinery nor electric power. Over half of those employed in modern factories were women. And it was women who organized the first modern strike in 1886. After 1900, the number of men began to increase, but only in the 1930s did male workers begin to outnumber women. The size of factories also began to increase. Factories employing more than 100 workers, just over 1,000 in 1909, jumped to over 2,000 by 1920 and 4,000 by the 1930s, yet even in 1940, there were over 550,000 workshops that employed less than 5 employees. This sustained the family-centered ideology, just as nationalism was sustained by a strong patriarchal system under an emperor who was like a family patriarch. The rapid and unregulated growth of industry and the demand for natural resources such as timber led to environmental destruction. Tanaka Shozo, elected to the first House of Representatives, launched the first agitation against industrial pollution in 1897 with 800 villagers in a mass protest forcing the government to take action. Aggressivationalism. The Meiji Constitution was based on a restricted franchise and created a diet. The Japanese used the German word for parliament because of the influence of German legal ideas, with limited powers. The leaders who brought about the imperial restoration continued to exercise power and even established political parties. Between 1918 and 1931, popularly elected prime ministers formed cabinets. Thereafter, they lost power to national unity cabinets formed across party lines. The emperor was the commander of the forces, and from 1890 this was interpreted to mean that the army and the navy had independent control. In 1899, the prime minister ordered that only serving generals and admirals could become ministers. This strengthening of the military, together with the expansion of Japan's colonial empire, was connected with the fear that Japan was at the mercy of the Western powers. This fear was used to silence opposition to military expansion and to higher taxes to fund the armed forces. Westernization and tradition. Successive generations of Japanese intellectuals had different views on Japan's relations with other countries. To some, the USA and Western European countries were at the highest point of civilization, to which Japan aspired. Fukuzawa Yukichi, a leading Meiji intellectual, expressed this by saying that Japan must expel Asia. He meant that Japan must shed its Asian characteristics and become part of the West. The next generation questioned this total acceptance of Western ideas and urged that national pride be built on indigenous values. The philosopher Miyake Setsurai (1860–1945) argued that each nation must develop its special talents in the interest of world civilization. To devote oneself to one's country is to devote oneself to the world. By contrast, many intellectuals were attracted to Western liberalism and wanted a Japan based not on the military but on democracy. Ueki Amori (1857–1892), a leader of the popular rights movement, was demanding constitutional government, admired the French Revolution's doctrine of the natural rights of man and of popular sovereignty, and spoke for a liberal education that would develop each individual. Freedom is more precious than order. Others even advocated voting rights for women. This pressure led the government to announce a constitution. Daily life. Japan's transformation into a modern society can be seen also in the changes in everyday life. The patriarchal household system comprised many generations living together under the control of the head of the house, but as more people became affluent, new ideas of the family spread. The new home, homu as the Japanese say, using the English word, was that of the nuclear family, where husband and wife lived as breadwinner and homemaker. This new concept domesticity in turn generated demands for new types domestic goods, new types family entertainments, and new forms. Housing. In the 1920s, construction companies made cheap housing available for a down payment of 200 yen and a monthly installment of 12 yen for 10 years, this at a time when the salary of a bank employee, a person with higher education, was 40 yen per month. Overcoming modernity, status-centered nationalism found full expression in the 1930s and 1940s as Japan launched wars to extend its empire in China and other parts of Asia, a war that merged into the Second World War after Japan attacked the USA at Pearl Harbor. This period saw greater controls on society, the repression and imprisonment of dissidents, as well as the formation of patriotic societies, many of them women's organizations, to support the war. An influential symposium on overcoming modernity in 1943 debated the dilemma facing Japan, of how to combat the West while being modern. A musician, Moroi Saburo, posed the question of how to rescue music from the art of sensory stimulation and restore it to an art of the spirit. He was not rejecting Western music but trying to find a way that went beyond merely rewriting or playing Japanese music on Western instruments. The philosopher Nishitani Kiji defined modern as the unity of three streams of Western thought: the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of natural sciences. He argued that Japan's moral energy, a term taken from the German philosopher Rank, had helped it to escape colonization, and it was its duty to establish a new world order, a greater East Asia. For this, a new vision that would integrate science and religion was necessary. After defeat, re-emerging as a global economic power, Japan's attempt to carve out a colonial empire ended with its defeat by the Allied forces. It has been argued that nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to shorten the war. But others think the immense destruction and suffering it caused were unnecessary. Under the U.S. LED occupation, 1945 to 1947, Japan was demilitarized and a new constitution introduced. This had Article 9, the so-called No War Clause, that renounces the use of war as an instrument of state policy. Agrarian reforms, the re-establishment of trade unions, and an attempt to dismantle the zaibatsu, or large monopoly houses that dominated the Japanese economy, were also carried out. Political parties were revived, and the first post-war elections held in 1946 where women voted for the first time. The rapid rebuilding of the Japanese economy after its shattering defeat was called a post-war miracle. But it was more than that, it was firmly rooted in its long history. The constitution was democratized only now, but the Japanese had a historic tradition of popular struggles and intellectual engagement with how to broaden political participation. The social cohesion of the pre-war years was strengthened, allowing for a close working of the government, bureaucracy, and industry. As support, as well as the demand created by the Korean and the Vietnamese wars, also helped the Japanese economy. The 1964 Olympics held in Tokyo marked a symbolic coming of age. In much the same way the network of high-speed Shinkansen, or bullet trains, started in 1964, which ran at 200 miles per hour, now it is 300 miles per hour, have come to represent the ability of the Japanese to use advanced technologies to produce better and cheaper goods. The 1960s saw the growth of civil society movements as industrialization had been pushed with utter disregard to its effect on health and the environment. Cadmium poisoning, which led to a painful disease, was an early indicator, followed by mercury poisoning in Minamata in the 1960s and problems caused by air pollution in the early 1970s. Grassroots pressure groups began to demand recognition of these problems as well as compensation for the victims. Government action and new legal regulations helped to improve conditions. From the mid-1980s there has been an increasing decline in interest in environmental issues as Japan enacted some of the strictest environmental controls in the world. Today, as a developed country, it faces the challenge of using its political and technological capabilities to maintain its position as a leading world power. The modern history of China has revolved around the question of how to regain sovereignty, end the humiliation of foreign occupation, and bring about equality and development. Chinese debates were marked by the views of three groups. The early reformers such as Kang Youwei (1858–1927) or Leng Keqiao (1873–1929) tried to use traditional ideas in new and different ways to meet the challenges posed by the West. Second, Republican revolutionaries such as Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Republic, were inspired by ideas from Japan and the West. The third, the Communist Party of China (CCP), wanted to end age-old inequalities and drive out the foreigners. The beginning of modern China can be traced to its first encounter with the West in the 16th and 17th centuries when Jesuit missionaries introduced Western sciences such as astronomy and mathematics. Limited though its immediate impact was, it set in motion events that gathered momentum in the 19th century when Britain used force to expand its lucrative trade in opium, leading to the First Opium War, 1839–42. This undermined the ruling Qing dynasty and strengthened demands for reform and change. Qing reformers such as Kang Yuwei and Leng Qichao realized the need to strengthen the system and initiated policies to build a modern administrative system, a new army and an educational system, and set up local assemblies to establish constitutional government. They saw the need to protect China from colonization. The negative example of colonized countries worked powerfully on Chinese thinkers. The partition of Poland in the 18th century was a much discussed example. So much so that by the late 1890s it came to be used as a verb, to Poland use, Poland wo. India was another such example. In 1903, the thinker Leng Qichao, who believed that only by making people aware that China was a nation would they be able to resist the West, wrote that India was a country that was destroyed by a non-country, that is the East India Company. He criticized Indians for being cruel to their own people and subservient to the British. Such arguments carried a powerful appeal as ordinary Chinese could see that the British used Indian soldiers in their wars on China. Above all, many felt that traditional ways of thinking had to be changed. Confucianism, developed from the teachings of Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, and his disciples, was concerned with good conduct, practical wisdom and proper social relationships. It influenced the Chinese attitude toward life, provided social standards and laid the basis for political theories and institutions. It was now seen as a major barrier to new ideas and institutions. To train people in modern subjects, students were sent to study in Japan, Britain and France and bring back new ideas. Many Chinese students went to Japan in the 1890s. They not only brought back new ideas but many became leading Republicans. The Chinese borrowed even Japanese translations of European words such as justice, rights, and revolution because they used the same ideographic script, a reversal of the traditional relationship. In 1905, just after the Russo-Japanese War, a war fought on Chinese soil and over Chinese territory, the centuries-old Chinese examination system that gave candidates entry into the elite ruling class was abolished, establishing the Republic. The Manchu Empire was overthrown and a republic established in 1911 under Sun Yat-sen, 1866 to 1925, who is unanimously regarded as the founder of modern China. He came from a poor family and studied in missionary schools where he was introduced to democracy and Christianity. He studied medicine but was greatly concerned about the fate of China. His program was called the Three Principles, San Min Kui. These were nationalism, this meant overthrowing the Manchu who were seen as a foreign dynasty, as well as other foreign imperialists, democracy or establishing democratic government, and socialism regulating capital and equalizing land holdings. The social and political situation continued to be unstable. On the 4th of May 1919, an angry demonstration was held in Beijing to protest against the decisions of the post-war peace conference. Despite being an ally of the victorious side led by Britain, China did not get back the territories seized from it. The protest became a movement. It galvanized a whole generation to attack tradition and to call for saving China through modern science, democracy and nationalism. Revolutionaries called for driving out the foreigners, who were controlling the country's resources, to remove inequalities and reduce poverty. They advocated reforms such as the use of simple language in writing, abolishing the practice of foot binding and the subordination of women, equality in marriage, and economic development to end poverty. After the Republican Revolution, the country entered a period of turmoil. The Kuomintang, the National People's Party, and the CCP emerged as major forces striving to unite the country and bring stability. Sun Yat-sen's ideas became the basis of the political philosophy of the Kuomintang. They identified the four great needs as clothing, food, housing and transportation. After the death of Sun, Chiang Kai-shek, 1887 to 1975, emerged as the leader of the Kuomintang as he launched a military campaign to control the warlords, regional leaders who had usurped authority, and to eliminate the communists. He advocated a secular and rational, worldly, Confucianism, but also sought to militarize the nation. The people, he said, must develop a habit and instinct for unified behavior. He encouraged women to cultivate the four virtues of chastity, appearance, speech and work, and recognized their role as confined to the household. Even the length of hemlines was prescribed. The Kuomintang's social base was in urban areas. Industrial growth was slow and limited. In cities such as Shanghai, which became the centers of modern growth, by 1919 an industrial working class had appeared numbering 500,000. Of these, however, only a small percentage were employed in modern industries such as shipbuilding. Most were petty urbanites, Shaoshimen, traders and shopkeepers. Urban workers, particularly women, earned very low wages. Working hours were long and conditions of work bad. As individualism increased, there was a growing concern with women's rights, ways to build the family and discussions about love and romance. Social and cultural change was helped along by the spread of schools and universities. Peking University was established in 1902. Journalism flourished, reflecting the growing attraction of this new thinking. The Popular Life Weekly, edited by Zhao Taofen, 1895–1944, is representative of this new trend. It introduced readers to new ideas, as well as to leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi and Kemal Ataturk, the modernist leader of Turkey. Its circulation increased rapidly from just 2,000 in 1926 to a massive 200,000 copies in 1933. The Kuomintang, despite its attempts to unite the country, failed because of its narrow social base and limited political vision. A major plank in Sun Yat-sen's program, regulating capital and equalizing land, was never carried out because the party ignored the peasantry and the rising social inequalities. It sought to impose military order rather than address the problems faced by the people. Timeline: Japan 1603. Tokugawa Ieyasu establishes the Edo Shogunate. 1630. Japan closes country to Western powers except for restricted trade with the Dutch. 1854. Japan and the USA conclude the Treaty of Peace, ending Japan's seclusion. 1868. Restoration of Meiji. 1872. Compulsory education system, first railway line between Tokyo and Yokohama. 1889. Meiji Constitution enacted. 1894–95. War between Japan and China. 1904–05. War between Japan and Russia. 1910. Korea annexed, colony till 1945. 1914–18. First World War. 1925. Universal male suffrage. 1931. Japan's invasion of China. 1941–45. The Pacific War. 1945. Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 1946–52. U.S. LED occupation of Japan, reforms to democratize and demilitarize Japan. 1956. Japan becomes a member of the United Nations. 1964. Olympic Games in Tokyo, the first time in Asia. China 1644–1911, Qing Dynasty. 1839–1862, Opium Wars. 1912. Sun Yat-sen founds Kuomintang. 1919. May 4th Movement. 1921. CCP founded. 1926–1949. Civil Wars in China. 1934. Long March. 1949. People's Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek founds Republic of China in Taiwan. 1962. China attacks India over border dispute. 1966. Cultural Revolution. 1976. Death of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. 1997. Hong Kong returned to China by Britain. The rise of the Communist Party of China. When the Japanese invaded China in 1937, the Kuomintang retreated. The long and exhausting war weakened China. Prices rose 30% per month between 1945 and 1949, and utterly destroyed the lives of ordinary people. Rural China faced two crises, one ecological, with soil exhaustion, deforestation and floods, and the second, a socio-economic one caused by exploitative land tenure systems, indebtedness, primitive technology and poor communications. CCP had been founded in 1921, soon after the Russian Revolution. The Russian success exercised a powerful influence around the world, and leaders such as Lenin and Trotsky went on to establish the Comintern, or the Third International, in March 1918 to help bring about a world government that would end exploitation. The Comintern and the Soviet Union supported communist parties around the world, but they worked within the traditional Marxist understanding that revolution would be brought about by the working class in cities. Its initial appeal across national boundaries was immense, but it soon became a tool for Soviet interests and was dissolved in 1943. Mao Zedong, 1893–1976, who emerged as a major CCP leader, took a different path by basing his revolutionary program on the peasantry. His success made the CCP a powerful political force that ultimately won against the Kuomintang. Mao Zedong's radical approach can be seen in Jiangxi, in the mountains, where they camped from 1928 to 1934, secure from Kuomintang attacks. A strong peasants' council, Soviet, was organized, united through confiscation and redistribution of land. Mao, unlike other leaders, stressed the need for an independent government and army. He had become aware of women's problems and supported the emergence of rural women's associations, promulgated a new marriage law that forbade arranged marriages, stopped purchase or sale of marriage contracts, and simplified divorce. In a survey in 1930 in Zunwu, Mao Zedong looked at everyday commodities such as salt and soya beans, at the relative strengths of local organizations, at petty traders and craftsmen, ironsmiths and prostitutes, and the strength of religious organizations to examine the different levels of exploitation. He gathered statistics of the number of peasants who had sold their children and found out what price they received. Boys were sold for 100 to 200 yuan, but there were no instances of the sale of girls because the need was for hard labor, not sexual exploitation. It was on the basis of these studies that he advocated ways of solving social problems. The Kuomintang blockade of the Communist Soviet forced the party to seek another base. This led them to go on what came to be called the Long March, 1934 to 1935, 6,000 grueling and difficult miles to Shaanxi. Here, in their new base in Yan'an, they further developed their program to end warlordism, carry out land reforms, and fight foreign imperialism. This won them a strong social base. In the difficult years of the war, the Communists and the Kuomintang worked together, but after the end of the war the Communists established themselves in power and the Kuomintang was defeated. Establishing the EW democracy, 1949–65 the People's Republic. Establishing the EW democracy, 1949–65 the People's Republic of China government was established in 1949. It was based on the principles of the New Democracy, an alliance of all social classes, unlike the dictatorship of the proletariat that the Soviet Union said it had established. Critical areas of the economy were put under government control, and private enterprise and private ownership of land were gradually ended. This program lasted till 1953 when the government declared that it would launch a program of socialist transformation. The Great Leap Forward movement launched in 1958 was a policy to galvanize the country to industrialize rapidly. People were encouraged to set up steel furnaces in their backyards. In the rural areas, people's communes, where land would be collectively owned and cultivated, were started. By 1958, there were 26,000 communes covering 98% of the farm population. Mao was able to mobilize the masses to attain the goals set by the party. His concern was with creating a socialist man, who would have 5 loves: fatherland, people, labor, science and public property. Mass organizations were created for farmers, women, students and other groups. For instance, the Alchina Democratic Women's Federation had 76 million members, the Alchina Students' Federation 3.29 million members. These objectives and methods did not appeal to everyone in the party. In 1953-54, some were urging for more attention to industrial organization and economic growth. Liu Shaoqi (1896–1969) and Deng Xiaoping (1904–1997) tried to modify the commune system as it was not working efficiently. The steel produced in the backyard furnaces was unusable industrially. Conflicting visions, 1965–1978. The conflict between the Maoists wanting to create a socialist man and those who objected to his emphasis on ideology rather than expertise culminated in Mao launching the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in 1965 to counter his critics. The Red Guards, mainly students and the army, was used for a campaign against old culture, old customs and old habits. Students and professionals were sent to the countryside to learn from the masses. Ideology, being communist, was more important than having professional knowledge. Denunciations and slogans replaced rational debate. The Cultural Revolution began a period of turmoil, weakened the party and severely disrupted the economy and educational system. From the late 1960s, the tide began to turn. In 1975, the party once again laid emphasis on greater social discipline and the need to build an industrial economy so that China could become a power before the end of the century. Reforms from 1978. The Cultural Revolution was followed by a process of political maneuvering. Deng Xiaoping kept party control strong while introducing a socialist market economy. In 1978, the party declared its goal as the four modernizations, to develop science, industry, agriculture, defense. Debate was allowed as long as the party was not questioned. In this new and liberating climate, as at the time of the May 4th movement 60 years earlier, there was an exciting explosion of new ideas. On the 5th of December 1978, a wall poster, The Fifth Modernization, proclaimed that without democracy the other modernizations would come to nothing. It went on to criticize the CCP for not solving the problem of poverty or ending sexual exploitation, even citing cases of such abuse from within the party. These demands were suppressed, but in 1989, on the 70th anniversary of the May 4th movement, many intellectuals called for a greater openness and an end to ossified dogmas, Su Xiaoji. Student demonstrators at Tiananmen Square in Beijing were brutally repressed. This was strongly condemned around the world. The post-reform period has seen the emergence of debates on ways to develop China. The dominant view supported by the party is based on strong political control, economic liberalization and integration into the world market. Critics argue that increasing inequalities between social groups, between regions and between men and women are creating social tensions, and question the heavy emphasis on the market. Finally, there is a growing revival of earlier so-called traditional ideas of Confucianism and arguments that China can build a modern society following its own traditions, rather than simply copying the West. The story of Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek, defeated by the CCP, fled in 1949 to Taiwan with over $300 million in gold reserves and crates of priceless art treasures and established the Republic of China. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony since the Chinese ceded it after the 1894–1895 war with Japan. The Cairo Declaration, 1943, and the Potsdam Proclamation, 1949, restored sovereignty to China. Massive demonstrations in February 1947 had led the GMD to brutally kill a whole generation of leading figures. The GMD, under Chiang Kai-shek, went on to establish a repressive government forbidding free speech and political opposition and excluding the local population from positions of power. However, they carried out land reforms that increased agricultural productivity and modernized the economy so that by 1973 Taiwan had a GNP second only to that of Japan in Asia. The economy, largely dependent on trade, has been steadily growing, but what is important is that the gap between the rich and poor has been steadily declining. Even more dramatic has been the transformation of Taiwan into a democracy. It began slowly after the death of Chiang in 1975 and grew in momentum when martial law was lifted in 1987 and opposition parties were legally permitted. The first free elections began the process of bringing local Taiwanese to power. Diplomatically, most countries have only trade missions in Taiwan. Full diplomatic relations and embassies are not possible as Taiwan is considered to be part of China. The question of reunification with the mainland remains a contentious issue, but cross-strait relations, that is between Taiwan and China, have been improving and Taiwanese trade and investments in the mainland are massive and travel has also become easier. China may be willing to tolerate a semi-autonomous Taiwan as long as it gives up any move to seek independence. Two roads to modernization. Industrial societies far from becoming like each other have found their own paths to becoming modern. The histories of Japan and China show how different historical conditions led them on widely divergent paths to building independent and modern nations. Japan was successful in retaining its independence and using traditional skills and practices in new ways. However, its elite-driven modernization generated an aggressive nationalism, helped to sustain a repressive regime that stifled dissent and demands for democracy, and established a colonial empire that left a legacy of hatred in the region as well as distorted internal developments. Japan's program of modernization was carried out in an environment dominated by Western imperial powers. While it imitated them, it also attempted to find its own solutions. Japanese nationalism was marked by these different compulsions. While many Japanese hoped to liberate Asia from Western domination, for others these ideas justified building an empire. It is important to note that the transformation of social and political institutions and daily life was not just a question of reviving traditions, or tenaciously preserving them, but rather of creatively using them in new and different ways. For instance, the Meiji school system, modeled on European and American practices, introduced new subjects, but the curriculum's main objective was to make loyal citizens. A course on morals that stressed loyalty to the emperor was compulsory. Similarly, changes in the family or in daily life show how foreign and indigenous ideas were brought together to create something new. The Chinese path to modernization was very different. Foreign imperialism, both Western and Japanese, combined with a hesitant and unsure Qing dynasty to weaken government control and set the stage for a breakdown of political and social order, leading to immense misery for most of the warlordism, banditry and civil war exacted a heavy toll on human lives, as did the savagery of the Japanese invasion. Natural disasters added to this burden. The 19th and 20th centuries saw a rejection of traditions and a search for ways to build national unity and strength. The CCP and its supporters fought to put an end to tradition, which they saw as keeping the masses in poverty, the women subjugated and the country undeveloped. While calling for power to the people, it built a highly centralized state. The success of the communist program promised hope, but its repressive political system turned the ideals of liberation and equality into slogans to manipulate the people. Yet it did remove centuries-old inequalities, spread education and raise consciousness among the people. The party has now carried out market reforms and has been successful in making China economically powerful, but its political system continues to be tightly controlled. The society now faces growing inequalities, as well as a revival of traditions long suppressed. This new situation again poses the question of how China can develop while retaining its heritage. Tale of the Genji, a fictionalized diary of the Heian court written by Murasaki Shikibu. The Tale of the Genji became the central work of fiction in Japanese literature. That period saw the emergence of many women writers, like Murasaki, who wrote in the Japanese script, while men wrote in the Chinese script, used for education and government. The novel depicts the romantic life of Prince Genji and is a striking picture of the aristocratic atmosphere of the Heian court. It shows the independence that women had in choosing their husbands and living their lives. Nishijin is a quarter in Kyoto. In the 16th century, it had a weavers' guild of 31 households, and by the end of the 17th century the community numbered over 70,000 people. Sericulture spread and was encouraged by an order in 1713 that only domestic yarn was to be used. Nishijan specialized only in the most expensive products. Silk production helped the growth of a class of regional entrepreneurs who challenged the Tokugawa order, and when foreign trade started in 1859, Japan's silk exports became a major source of profit for the economy struggling to compete with Western goods. The Japanese had borrowed their written script from the Chinese in the 6th century. However, since their language is very different from Chinese, they developed two phonetic alphabets, hiragana and katakana. Hiragana is considered feminine because it was used by many women writers in the Heian period, such as Murasaki. It is written using a mixture of Chinese characters and phonetics so that the main part of the word is written with a character. For instance, in, going, go, would be written with a character and the ing in phonetics. The existence of a phonetic syllabary meant that knowledge spread from the elites to the wider society relatively quickly. In the 1880s, it was suggested that Japanese develop a completely phonetic script, or adopt a European language. Neither was done. Tanaka Shozo, 1841–1913, the self-taught son of a farmer, he rose to become a major political figure. He participated in the popular rights movement in the 1880s, a movement demanding constitutional government. He was elected member to the First Diet. He believed that ordinary people should not be sacrificed for industrial progress. The Ashio mine was polluting the Waterace River, ruining 100 square miles of farmland and affecting 1,000 families. The agitation forced the company to take pollution control measures so that by 1904 harvests were normal. Fukuzawa Yukichi, 1835–1901, born in an impoverished samurai family, he studied in Nagasaki and Osaka, learning Dutch and Western sciences and, later, English. In 1860, he went as a translator for the first Japanese embassy to the USA. This provided material for a book on the West, written not in the classical but in the spoken style that became extremely popular. He established a school that is today Keio University. He was one of the core members of the Marokusha, a society to promote Western learning. In the encouragement to learning, Gakumen no Susum, 1872–1876, he was very critical of Japanese knowledge. All that Japan has to be proud of is its scenery. He advocated not just modern factories and institutions but the cultural essence of the West, the spirit of civilization. With this spirit it would be possible to build a new citizen. His principle was, heaven did not create men above men, nor set men below men, Car Club Moga, an abbreviation for modern girl. It represented the coming together in the 20th century of ideas of gender equality, a cosmopolitan culture and a developed economy. The new middle-class families enjoyed new forms of travel and entertainment. Transport in cities improved with electric trams, public parks were opened from 1878, and department stores began to be built. In Tokyo, the Ginza became a fashionable area for Ginbara, a word combining Ginza and Berbera, walking aimlessly. The first radio stations opened in 1925. Matsui Sumiko, an actress, became a national star. Women's carpool. With her portrayal of Nora in the Norwegian writer Ibsen's A Doll's House. Movies began to be made in 1899 and soon there were a dozen companies making hundreds of films. The period was one of great vitality and the questioning of traditional norms of social and political behavior. The opium trade, the demand for Chinese goods such as tea, silk and porcelain created a serious ball and soft trade problem. Western goods did not find a market in China, so payment had to be in silver. The East India Company found a new option, opium, which grew in India. They sold the opium in China and gave the silver that they earned to company agents in Canton in return for letters of credit. The company used the silver to buy tea, silk and porcelain to sell in Britain. This was the triangular trade between Britain, India and China. The examination system entry to the elite ruling class, about 1.1 million till 1850, had been largely through an examination. This required writing an 8-legged essay, Paku Wen, in classical Chinese in a prescribed form. The examination was held twice every 3 years, at different levels, and of those allowed to sit only 1 to 2% passed the first level, usually by the age of 24, to become what was called beautiful talent. At any given time before 1850 there were about 526,869 civil and 212,330 military provincial Shengyuan degree holders in the whole country. Since there were only 27,000 official positions, many lower-level degree holders did not have jobs. The examination acted as a barrier to the development of science and technology as it demanded only literary skills. In 1905, it was abolished as it was based on skills in classical Chinese learning that had, it was felt, no relevance for the modern world. Shanghai in 1935, Buck Clayton, a black American trumpet player, in Shanghai with his jazz orchestra lived the life of the privileged expatriates. But he was black and once some white Americans assaulted him and his orchestra members and threw them out from the hotel they played in. Thus, though American, he had greater sympathy for the plight of the Chinese, being himself a victim of racial discrimination. Of their fight with white Americans where they emerged victorious he writes, "The Chinese onlookers treated us like we had done something they always wanted to do and followed us all the way home, cheering us like a winning football team." On the poverty and hard life of the Chinese, Clayton writes, "I would see sometimes 20 or 30 coolies pulling a big heavy cart that in America would be pulled by a truck or horses. These people seemed to be nothing but human horses, and all they would get at the end of the day was just enough to get a couple of bowls of rice and a place to sleep. I do not know how they did it." Conclusion: This book on themes of world history has taken you across vast stretches of time, ancient, medieval, modern. It has focused on some of the more prominent themes of human evolution and development. Each section has covered the following, increasingly foreshortened, periods: 1. C. 6 million years ago 400 BCE. 2. BCE 400, 1300 CE. 3. 800, 1700 CE. 4. 1700 to 2000 CE. Although historians tend to specialize in ancient, medieval and modern periods, the historian's craft displays certain common features and predicaments. We have attempted to nuance the distinction between ancient, medieval and modern in order to convey a holistic idea of how history is written and discussed, as also to equip you with an overall understanding of human history that goes well beyond our modern roots. The book would have allowed you a glimpse into the history of Africa, West and Central Asia, East Asia, Australia, North and South America and Europe, including the United Kingdom. It would have familiarized you with what may be called the case study method. Instead of burdening you with enormous detail about the history of all these places, we felt it would be better to examine key illustrations of certain phenomena in detail. World history can be written in many ways. One of these, perhaps the oldest, is to focus on contact between peoples, to stress the interconnectedness of cultures and civilizations, and to explore the multifarious dimensions of world historical change. An alternative is to identify relatively self-contained, though expanding, regions of economic exchange that sustained certain forms of culture and power. A third method specifies differences in the historical experience of nations and regions to highlight their distinctive characteristics. You would have found traces of each of these approaches in the book. But differences between societies and individuals go hand in hand with similarities. Interlinkages, connections and similarities among human communities always existed. The interplay of the global and the local, the world in a grain of sand, the mainstream and the marginal, the general and the specific, which you would have gleaned from this book, are a fascinating aspect of the study of history. Our account began from scattered settlements in Africa, Asia and Europe. From there we moved on to city life in Mesopotamia. Early empires were created around cities in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Persia and India. Empires of greater extent followed them, the Greek, Macedonian, Roman, Arab and, from the 1200s, the Mongol. Trading operations, technology and government were often highly intricate in these empires. Very often, they were based on effective use of a written language. A new era in human history took shape as a consequence of a combination of technological and organizational changes that occurred in Western Europe in the middle of the second millennium CE, from the 1400s onwards. These were linked to the Renaissance, or rebirth, of civilization, whose primary impact was felt in the cities of northern Italy, but whose influence spread quickly over Europe. This Renaissance was the product of the region's city life, and of extensive interactions with Byzantium and the Muslim world of the Mediterranean. Over time, ideas and discoveries were carried to the Americas by explorers and conquerors, in the 16th century CE. Some of these notions were carried later to Japan, India and elsewhere as well. European preeminence in global trade, politics and culture did not come at this time. It was to be the feature of the 18th and 19th centuries, when the Industrial Revolution took place in Britain, and spread to Europe. Britain, France and Germany were able to create systems of colonial control over parts of Africa and Asia, systems more intense and powerful than those of earlier empires. By the mid-20th century, the technology, economic life and culture that had once made European states powerful had been reworked in the rest of the world to create the foundations of modern life. You must have noticed passages quoted in the various chapters of the book. Many of these are extracts for what historians call primary sources. Scholars construct history from such materials, drawing their facts from them. They critically evaluate these materials and are attentive to their ambiguities. Different historians may use a given source material to advance vastly different, even contradictory arguments about historical phenomena. As with the other human sciences, history can be made to speak to us in varied voices. This is because of the intricate relationship between the historian's reasoning and historical facts. In your final year at school you will be studying aspects of Indian, or South Asian, history from Harappan times to the making of modern India's constitution. Again, the emphasis will be on a judicious mix of political, economic, social and cultural history, inviting you to engage with chosen themes through the CASA study method. We hope these books will help you formulate your own answers to so many questions, above all to the question, why study history? Do you know the gifted medievalist, Mark Bloch, began his book, The Historian's Craft, written in the trenches during the Second World War, by recalling a young boy's question, "Tell me, Daddy, what is the use of history?" Document finished.